The regiment known as the Tanith First and Only was not intended to be named so. In its earliest form, it was simply meant to be the founding contribution of the forested world of Tanith to the broader strategic efforts of the Astra Militarum. As was standard across the Imperium, Tanith was selected by Imperial Tactica Command to raise a regiment due to its loyalist status, its growing population, and its unique planetary geography. With its population spread among cloaked settlements within deep, mist-covered forests, and its people trained in stealth, hunting, and close-quarters survival from a young age, Tanith was considered a strong candidate to produce a light infantry force specialised in reconnaissance, infiltration, and sudden assault. The founding process began formally in the year 798 of the 41st millennium. On Tanith, there was little precedent for off-world warfare. The population lived in traditional clans governed by hereditary chiefs and guided by a priesthood deeply intertwined with the planet's mythic and ritualistic culture. However, the call to raise a regiment was met with enthusiasm. It was viewed as a mark of pride, a chance to bring the legacy of Tanith beyond its heavily forested borders. Thousands volunteered from all three major hive settlements, Tanith Magna, Tanith First Sight, and Nassadon. Most had no knowledge of what lay beyond their sky. They brought knives carved from local ironbark, cloaks dyed in forest hues, and a quiet, confident resolve. Colonel-Commissar Ibram Gaunt, a relatively young but already decorated officer of the commissariat, was appointed to oversee the raising of the regiment. He had been granted the rare dual commission of Colonel and Commissar directly by War Master Slado, and he took personal interest in selecting the recruits. Gaunt's presence during the formation was noted by local observers as aloof but respectful. He listened to the clan leaders, walked the forests, and held the first muster drills with patience and calm authority. Many of the Tanith soldiers grew to respect him quickly, though they did not yet know what role he would play in their fate. Only days after the formal raising of the regiment, and before the final muster could even be completed, disaster struck. On the same night as the founding ceremony, a Chaos fleet entered orbit above Tanith. The fleet was part of a long-running Chaos offensive known as the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, a multi-system campaign aimed at destabilizing and reconquering Imperial space in the region. Tanith, isolated and largely undefended, was chosen for annihilation. The destruction was total. Orbital bombardment began within hours. Forests were turned to ash. Cities were vaporized. Millions died in minutes. There was no opportunity for defense. Only the newly raised regiment, along with a handful of support personnel, had already embarked aboard the Imperial fleet in orbit, having launched earlier that day for deployment processing. Gaunt was placed in the impossible position of watching the homeworld of his newly formed regiment be destroyed before they had ever seen combat. He made the decision not to return to the surface, a decision that some survivors resented in the moment, but that ultimately ensured their survival. The Tanith First, instead of becoming one of many line infantry regiments from Imperial worlds, became a living relic of a dead planet. They would be referred to from that point onward as the Tanith First and Only. In the immediate aftermath, Gaunt allowed mourning and ritual to take place. He gave the men time to grieve, to cut ritual scars, and to gather in silence. But he also issued orders. The regiment would carry on. Tanith would live through them. What had been a standard deployment became a crusade of preservation, remembrance, and vengeance. The regiment was given its full classification, the Tanith First and Only Reconnaissance Regiment. They would become specialists in scouting, stealth attacks, and sabotage missions, roles that fit their native skills almost too perfectly. The average soldier of the Tanith regiment was lean, quiet, and deceptively agile. Tanith men and women were typically between 5'10" and 6 feet in height, with sinewy muscle built from a life navigating dense forest. Most had dark hair and pale skin, an adaptation to their planet's low light. Their eyes were known for being sharp and constantly scanning. Tattoos and ritual scarification were common, often tied to clan affiliation or spiritual beliefs. Their camouflage cloaks, called camoleaf, were woven with native materials and adapted for stealth in any terrain. While their weaponry matched the standard kit of the Astra Militarum, flak armour, lasguns, grenades, the Tanith often personalised their gear, keeping carved tokens or bone fetishes tied to straps or hidden under armour plates. Socially, the regiment remained tightly knit. The Tanith did not operate like a standard guard unit. Command structure remained in place, with Gaunt at the top and a rotating cast of senior officers beneath him, but informal networks of clan allegiance, personal trust, and old rivalries constantly shaped internal cohesion. Rather than fight against this, Gaunt learned to use it. He promoted based on capability and loyalty, not just seniority. Units were often formed by those who had known each other since childhood. This resulted in unusually high cohesion and mutual trust in small teams, essential for reconnaissance work, where survival often depended on the silent cooperation of a few. Culturally, the Tanith held to their forest-born traditions. They spoke their native dialect among themselves, told stories around quiet campfires during rest periods, and carried out death rites even in the middle of war zones. The regiment's priests, known as Verghastite Redeemers, after the later incorporation of men from Verghast, helped maintain these traditions while integrating new soldiers into the Tanith way of life. Music, ritual knives, and forest symbolism persisted across campaigns. Even as years passed and soldiers died or were replaced by new recruits from other worlds, the spirit of Tanith was preserved, if not in blood, then in belief. The regiment's military doctrine centered on infiltration, mobility, and surgical strikes. Gaunt and his officers preferred to move behind enemy lines, gather intelligence, and cripple critical targets. The Tanith learned to exploit their surroundings, whether forest, ruins, hive sprawl, or ash wastes. They set ambushes, disappeared into the dark, and struck with speed. Standard battlefield engagements were rare, though not avoided when necessary. They were not an armoured force, nor a siege unit. They were ghosts with las guns, scouts and saboteurs who moved where others could not or dared not. In logistics, the Tanith First operated with relatively low support requirements. Their light equipment and high mobility meant they could deploy quickly and establish forward positions without needing massive infrastructure. Medical treatment was usually field-based, with wounded soldiers either returned to base camps or euthanized to avoid capture. Supplies were scavenged when possible. Food was rationed with military discipline, but many Tanith still preferred foraging or hunting when the terrain allowed it. Over time, the Tanith First and Only earned a growing reputation within the Imperium. They were not widely known in the early years of the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, but key engagements brought them fame. The battle for Fortis Binary, the liberation of Vervenhive, and the blood-soaked trenches of Fantine saw them proving their worth time and again. Gaunt's own leadership was instrumental. He was not merely an officer, he became a symbol. He earned the loyalty of his men not through fear, but through visible action, personal loss, and relentless will. Not all Tanith veterans stayed with the regiment. Some were lost in action, others reassigned or promoted elsewhere. But those who remained built something no other regiment could claim, a military culture entirely transplanted from a dead world and made to thrive in 1,000 alien environments. Within the Guard, where attrition and disintegration were expected, the Tanith First survived. That survival became their defiance. In the later years, new recruits from Verghast and Belladon were absorbed into the regiment, forming what became unofficially known as the Ghosts. While this diluted the pure Tanith lineage, it expanded the regiment's tactical range. Verghastite soldiers brought urban combat skills, while Belladon added mechanized elements. Gaunt insisted that the soul of Tanith remained dominant. Newcomers were required to adopt the traditions, wear the cloak, and earn their place. Some resented this. Others came to embrace it fully. In the end, the First and Only was no longer just about the trees and ghosts of Tanith. It had become a symbol of adaptation, survival, and refusal, the memory of a world that would not be erased. The Tanith First and Only operated with a technological philosophy that diverged from the standard expectations of most Astra Militarum regiments. Their equipment was chosen not for brute force or resilience, but for adaptability, silence, and rapid deployment. They favoured lightweight materials, silenced weaponry, and personalised kit modifications. Each soldier's gear was an extension of their survival mindset, streamlined, minimal, and customised for stealth operations. Their guns were often fitted with suppressors and reinforced stocks for close-quarters manoeuvring. Knives were universally carried, typically double-edged, and handcrafted either from Tanith ironbark or later forged materials meant to mimic their original tools. Unlike heavily mechanised or artillery-based regiments, the Tanith avoided reliance on armoured vehicles. Their strength lay in terrain control and concealment, not in shock and awe tactics. When vehicles were assigned to them, they were typically reconnaissance-class units, sentinels, light transports, or scout walkers. These were used sparingly, primarily for rapid extraction or long-range communication relays. The regiment's signal units maintained modified Vox systems designed for encryption and long-distance coordination across fragmented battlefields. Technological maintenance was handled by a small corps of tech adepts assigned by the Departmentum Unitorum. Though many Tanith developed basic mechanical skills out of necessity, field repairing optics, weapon conduits, or comms gear when official support was unavailable. The philosophical outlook toward machinery among the Tanith was one of pragmatic respect. They did not revere technology with the religious zeal of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but neither did they take it for granted. Tools were valued for what they enabled: silent movement, accurate fire, and uninterrupted communication. They treated gear maintenance as both survival and ritual. A soldier's cloak was oiled and brushed daily. A lasgun's charge pack was rotated and checked before every engagement. Camouflage netting was folded precisely. There was no room for waste and no forgiveness for neglect. Behaviourally, the Tanith were characterised by high situational awareness, strong peripheral instinct, and a cultural distrust of wasteful movement or noise. Their battlefield instincts had been shaped by generations of stalking prey through fog-shrouded forests, avoiding dangerous native predators, and learning to read terrain by sound and vibration. Even in the ruins of hive cities or the blackened fields of bombed-out moons, Tanith scouts displayed a tendency to pause and scan, to touch soil before advancing and to avoid open lines of sight. This translated into slower, more cautious tactical movement, but also into fewer casualties during ambushes or artillery strikes. Tanith soldiers rarely raised their voices. Orders were given in hand signals or low tones. In field camps, silence was the default unless given explicit permission to speak. This made them stand out from other regiments, particularly those used to loud barracks culture or overbearing drill procedures. Outsiders often found the Tanith distant or unnerving. Within the regiment, however, this silence was a language of its own, one where shared trauma, memory, and purpose replaced unnecessary speech. One of the most defining instincts among the Tanith was a deep-rooted loyalty to place. Though Tanith itself was gone, the memory of the forests, their colour, scent, and rhythm, remained burned into the minds of its surviving sons. Many of them carried tokens of home, a fragment of bark, a soil vial, or a hand-etched map of the old settlements. These objects were not superstition. They were mental anchors. The destruction of their world had left a wound that could not be healed, but could be focused, sharpened into purpose. Every battle won, every stronghold taken was a reclamation of something lost. This was not always visible in their mannerisms, but it radiated through their resolve. Within the First and Only, several key figures rose to prominence, not merely as leaders, but as legends. Ibram Gaunt remained the fulcrum, both commander and paternal figure. His command was marked by personal risk and constant presence. He led from the front whenever possible, shared rations during lean campaigns, and made battlefield decisions that balanced strategic necessity with human cost. Soldiers followed him not out of duty, but because he had saved their lives, or tried to, time and again. He was known to attend the funerals of fallen men, even when time did not permit. His coat, decorated with campaign medals and torn from years of conflict, became a symbol of the regiment's endurance. Among his officers, several stood out. Colm Corbeck, a massive, broad-shouldered man from Nassadon, was Gaunt's second in command and perhaps his closest friend. Known for his booming voice, easy humour and deep loyalty, Corbec was a figure of stability. He carried the weight of morale across the regiment, serving as both leader and confidant. His death during a later campaign sent deep shockwaves through the ranks, an absence that could not be filled. Another was Mad Larkin, the regiment's most gifted marksman. Though plagued by hallucinations and nervous episodes, Larkin's ability to eliminate targets from extreme distances was unmatched. His spotter spoke of shots fired through broken windows from kilometres away, or of finding Larkin perched silently in ruins long after battles had ended. Despite his mental state, he remained a respected and beloved figure, the kind of soldier who fought not because he believed in glory, but because he had nowhere else to exist. Major Rawn was a darker presence. Cold, pragmatic, and often at odds with Gaunt, Rawn came from a Tanith clan with strict internal codes. He initially resented Gaunt for the destruction of their world, and made no effort to conceal his hostility. However, over time his professionalism, cunning, and brutal effectiveness earned him a permanent place in the command hierarchy. He did not inspire, but he executed orders with efficiency, and his survival instincts were rarely wrong. The regiment also included Q, a dangerous and unstable killer who murdered fellow soldiers and was ultimately executed. Q represented the worst-case outcome of what Tanith instincts could become when twisted: stealth and lethality without honour. His presence served as a warning of what could fester if discipline was abandoned. Internally, the Tanith First and Only developed unofficial castes and divisions over time. Pureblood Tanith, those born on the world before its destruction, were often granted a subtle form of seniority. Their word carried more weight in disputes. Their traditions were taken as authoritative. Verghast and Belladon recruits, while technically equal in rank and role, had to prove themselves in battle and adopt Tanith customs to gain full acceptance. This included learning the Tanith dialect, taking a cloak, and participating in regimental rites. Integration was not always smooth. Some conflicts arose, particularly in early campaigns, where Verghastite soldiers challenged the dominance of Tanith traditions. Gaunt and his senior staff had to walk a careful line, enforcing unity without erasing identity. Religious practice within the regiment remained decentralized. While the ecclesiarchy maintained a presence through attached priests, most Tanith soldiers adhered to their ancestral beliefs, a nature-based spiritualism involving forest spirits, ancestral memory, and ritual offerings. It was not incompatible with Imperial creed, but it was not derived from it either. Gaunt allowed these practices to continue, arguing that morale and cohesion were more critical than theological purity. Ceremonies marking the full moons of Tanith, now only symbolic, were still held in secret. Soldiers recited oaths in their native tongue, dedicated kills to their ancestors, and wore hand-carved amulets for protection. Rituals of passage were common. Soldiers who completed their first mission were gifted a sash or blade. Death rites were sacred. A fallen ghost was buried with their cloak, and if possible, their remains were returned to the regiment's field chaplains for blessing. Ghosts never left their own behind, even if doing so cost lives. This code, enforced by peer pressure and tradition rather than command order, became one of the strongest binding forces in the unit. The combination of stealth tactics, deep-rooted culture, personal loss, and iron discipline made the Tanith First and Only one of the most unique regiments in the Astra Militarum. They were not bred for mass war. They were not suited to long sieges or armoured charges. But in the night, in the ruins, in the places where enemies believed they were safe, the ghosts were already watching. They made war like hunters. They made silence into a weapon. The practical application of Tanith doctrine across campaigns proved the value of their light infantry specialization. Their operations in the Sabbat Worlds Crusade consistently exploited terrain, enemy psychology, and the underestimated value of silence. Most of their engagements followed a predictable pattern: advance under concealment, identify strategic weak points, and strike with sudden, focused aggression. Targets included command posts, artillery positions, supply depots, or relay nodes. In multiple campaigns, they dismantled entire enemy movements not through massed force, but by collapsing infrastructure behind enemy lines. Typical formations included forward recon teams, equipped with enhanced optics and long-range Vox, backed by rapid redeployment fire squads. Veteran troopers were often deployed in 2s and 3s to establish observation positions, sometimes holding for days without relief. When engagements occurred, Tanith units relied on coordinated suppressive fire, flanking maneuvers, and surgical ambushes. They rarely held ground for long. Withdrawal was often pre-planned, with fallback paths marked or burned into their memory. Their discipline under pressure was especially noted by higher command. Even when outnumbered or flanked, Tanith squads broke contact cleanly, leaving traps or decoys behind. The command hierarchy was relatively lean. Gaunt maintained operational control over the entire regiment, but delegated tactical command to trusted officers. Field decisions were often made by platoon sergeants and junior officers operating semi-independently. This decentralized structure allowed the Ghosts to move faster than many rigid regiments. Orders were often issued with minimal detail, intent-based commands such as deny that road or disrupt supply movements, leaving room for improvisation. This flexibility turned the Ghosts into an ideal counterinsurgency force, but also a reliable vanguard unit in larger operations. Over time, individual squads developed specialized reputations. One example was the scout unit led by Sergeant McColl, widely regarded as the most skilled tracker and stealth operative in the regiment. McColl's movements were said to be inaudible even over loose shale. He trained his team in advanced infiltration, urban traversal, and even environmental mimicry, using light refraction and shadow patterns to disappear into terrain. Another notable example was the Scratch Company, a composite unit formed from survivors of multiple platoons, led at one point by Sergeant Varl. Though ad hoc in structure, the unit excelled in breaching fortified positions using unconventional methods such as sewage systems or collapsed infrastructure. Despite their reliance on stealth, Tanith units were not without brute force options. The regiment maintained a small arsenal of support weapons, including missile launchers, melter guns, and demolition charges. These were deployed selectively, usually in pre-planned ambushes or last-stand defense points. Heavy weapons crews were trained to relocate quickly after firing, avoiding counter-battery retaliation. Field engineering units also adapted enemy munitions into makeshift traps, often wiring explosive charges into local terrain using salvaged materials. On more than one occasion, entire Chaos-armoured columns were delayed or redirected by seemingly abandoned ruins rigged by Tanith sappers. The internal command structure respected both official rank and unofficial influence. Veterans who had survived multiple campaigns, regardless of their formal position, were often deferred to in crisis. There were known informal roles: watchers, firebreakers, lifelayers, not codified by the Departamento Munitorum but understood within the regiment. Watchers were scouts trusted with silent observation. Firebreakers were those who initiated first contact when stealth failed. Lifelayers served as combat medics, many trained through experience rather than formal instruction. These roles rotated fluidly, with trust as the determining factor more than record. Morale was maintained not through grand speeches or commissariat propaganda, but through consistency, ritual, and shared burden. Gaunt's leadership remained the stabilizing axis, but it was the soldiers themselves who enforced discipline and unity. Patrol rotations were tracked by custom markers. Fallen comrades were memorialized in the regiment's logbooks, often handwritten and passed between squads. Field rites were carried out in silence. A single grave marker carved into rubble could serve as a rallying point for an entire squad. As the regiment expanded with Verghastite and Belladon recruits, the behavioural tendencies of the Tanith began to evolve. Urban combat doctrines became integrated, particularly in close-quarters tunnel warfare and hive-sprawl navigation. Newer Ghosts brought diverse tactical philosophies, some favouring explosives, others close combat aggression. Gaunt allowed this variation to shape unit specialization. Certain squads became dedicated assault teams, while others remained purely recon. Internal competition was encouraged, with informal records of kill counts, objective clears, and recovery operations passed between platoons. This gamification of duty reinforced skill development without undermining cohesion. The long-term psychological profile of the Ghost was defined by resilience, controlled aggression, and an embedded sense of legacy. Every soldier, whether born on Tanith or not, was taught the story of their origin. Ghosts did not simply fight to win, they fought to remember. This gave their unit a grim but focused stability. They were not suicidal, but they were unafraid of death. Each casualty was another chapter in a narrative that had begun the day their home burned. Many described a sensation of invisibility, not just from their tactics, but from the way the Imperium often forgot them until results were needed. This absence of recognition bred a cold independence. The Tanith needed no medals. Their survival was its own record. The regiment developed unique terminology that shaped how they viewed operations. Ghosting became a common verb: to move unseen, to vanish after a strike, to leave no trace. Treeing up meant preparing for an ambush, even in terrain with no trees. The route referred to fallback routes or hidden tunnels. These phrases created a language only the Ghosts understood, reinforcing identity while streamlining communication. In terms of maintenance, the Tanith approach was austere but meticulous. Weapons were stripped and cleaned after every engagement. Cloaks were mended in silence. Boots were reinforced with locally sourced materials. When armour or webbing wore down, it was not replaced unless absolutely necessary. Soldiers took pride in gear that had survived as long as they had. Some lasguns bore over a decade of field scars. Optics were reconditioned using sand-polish techniques borrowed from desert campaigns. Field modifications were constant. Rubber grips, additional slings, and pressure-mute stocks were common. Each soldier shaped their gear to fit their exact style, and that gear was passed down when one fell. At the cultural level, the fusion of Tanith, Verghast, and Belladon traditions created something wholly unique. Shared oaths were sworn in multiple dialects. Symbols from all three worlds were incorporated into unit patches and etched into trench walls. Still, Tanith customs dominated, in part because of Gaunt's protection, but also because of the sheer gravity of a lost world. Even newcomers felt the weight of Tanith's absence, and chose to embrace its memory. To be a ghost was to become part of something older than oneself, something that refused to be forgotten. The final note of their military identity lay in how they treated enemies. The Tanith were not sadists, nor were they ideologues. They executed prisoners when necessary but avoided cruelty. They studied enemy doctrine obsessively. Captured maps, war gear, and comms logs were passed to their tacticians with discipline. In cases where chaos cults were involved, the Ghosts displayed a cold resolve. They knew what chaos had taken from them. They did not debate its evil. They dismantled it, silently, without mercy, and without need for recognition. By the end of their first decade in service, the Tanith First and Only had operated across dozens of war zones, survived attrition rates that would have dissolved other units, and evolved into one of the most reliable regiments in the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. They had no homeworld, they had no replacement line, but they moved like a shadow across battlefields, and wherever they passed, the enemy's confidence was the first to die. The Ghosts had become more than survivors. They were a myth-given form, a regiment without a planet but with a purpose so deeply etched into its bones that even death could not shake it. The Tanith First and Only entered the Imperial record as a full operational unit in the closing days of the year 798 of the 41st millennium. According to Adeptus Administratum archives filed under the Sabbat Worlds Crusade engagement ledger, the regiment's first logged entry listed it as a provisional light infantry reconnaissance unit under the command of Colonel-Commissar Ibram Gaunt. No homeworld designation was entered. The form was amended post-muster with the phrase, "Planet lost on founding day. Record stands as first and only." Administratum Protocol required confirmation from War Master Slado's regional adjutant before the regiment's name was formally accepted. That confirmation was granted with unusual speed. Tanith had ceased to exist, and so the First and Only would be its permanent military extension. Their first recorded deployment occurred shortly after mustering, during the early stages of the Crusade's eastern push. The target was Fortis Binary, an industrial world whose hive cities had fallen under the sway of chaos cults linked to the arch-enemy's Odeshi front. The Tanith were assigned to the 49th Army Group as recon support under Lord General Dravere. Their initial operational objective was to assist in mapping ingress routes into the western reaches of the Gerepen Hive, specifically tunnels and access shafts used by enemy logistic runners. The Administratum documentation from that campaign praised the Ghosts for their unusual adaptability and total concealment, citing multiple occasions where enemy patrols were neutralized with no Vox signals or counterfire detected. The Fortis Binary campaign marked the first instance where the Ghosts were explicitly requested by name for a second deployment wave. Gaunt's after-action reports were filed in complete detail, listing movement patterns, enemy strengths, and suggested disruption paths. While the Administratum noted his non-standard formatting, Gaunt preferred actionable field summaries over ornate honorific phrasing. His data was absorbed directly into regional intelligence maps. A marginal annotation within the campaign ledger, written by an Administratum clerk of the second grade, noted the regiment's capacity to operate without infrastructure, an unusually favourable remark for a lightly equipped unit. As the Crusade expanded, the Tanith were rotated across multiple theatres. Their next logged appearance was in the files concerning Menazoid Epsilon, a warzone marked by its erratic energy fields and heavy industrial ruin. Administratum deployment orders indicated that the Ghosts were assigned to infiltration and sabotage duties under the command of War Master Slado himself. Notably, a redacted margin comment in the personnel manifest refers to the Tanith as preferred Ghost element. Though the note lacked author signature, such language suggests early recognition of their strategic niche: irregular warfare, deep terrain penetration, and enemy morale disruption. During the Battle of Menazoid Epsilon, the Tanith executed a night infiltration into a chaos-held manufactorum complex. Using camo capes and pre-scouted drain routes, Gaunt's lead squads planted melter charges beneath primary ammunition silos. According to the Administratum battle report filed under Logistics Section 8, the resulting explosion destroyed 3 square kilometres of enemy supply chain infrastructure. Though casualties among the Ghosts were recorded, including the loss of a full platoon caught in the secondary detonation, the operation was deemed extremely successful with disproportionate strategic outcome. The regiment's commendation file from this campaign was updated with the phrase, "exemplary in sabotage under extreme enemy presence." Following this, the Tanith First and Only were assigned to Verghast, one of the largest recorded hive engagements of the Crusade's early decades. At the time, the hive city was under siege by forces from rival hive Phaerozoica, which had fallen to chaos worship and declared independent hostility toward the Imperium. Though not their original theatre, the Tanith were rerouted to reinforce loyalist defences after a sudden enemy advance overwhelmed the city's northern sectors. The redeployment order, issued by High Command and countersigned by Gaunt, was marked Urgent Insertion. High survival probability deemed low, proceed regardless. Verghast became a defining moment for the regiment. Unlike prior campaigns, where the Ghosts operated behind enemy lines or in unclaimed terrain, Verghast forced them into direct contact with both urban warfare and allied forces unused to their operating methods. Administratum field logs from the Verghast sector show multiple miscommunications between Tanith command squads and other Imperial regiments, particularly over unit spacing and radio silence protocol. However, once acclimated, the Ghosts adapted to the urban battlefield with speed. Gaunt split his regiment into hunter-killer squads, assigning each a primary building grid or sewer route. The infamous Hector Front operation, documented under Hive War Archive file V992B, listed the Tanith as executing a flanking assault through abandoned sewage lines, to eliminate an entrenched Zoikan artillery position. Internal cross-reports from Munitorum observers noted that the assault took place under total blackout conditions, with ghost squads moving silently beneath ferrocrete foundations and emerging directly beneath the enemy battery. The entire enemy position was neutralised without triggering alarms, and the artillery threat to the Hive's last functioning Prometheum refinery was ended within minutes. Casualty reports were minimal. The operation was retroactively named the Knife in the Gut. At the conclusion of the Vavun Hive campaign, the Tanith First and Only's official strength was listed at approximately 1,300 active duty soldiers, a reduction of nearly 20% from their Fortis binary numbers. Gaunt filed a petition to absorb Verghastite volunteers into the regiment, a request that was initially contested by the Departamento Munitorum. Their reasoning, according to the archived dispute form, was that regiments were not to be culturally merged unless formally approved by High Command. Gaunt's rebuttal cited field necessity and cultural convergence through shared survival. The War Master overruled the objection. The Tanith First and Only remained intact, now supplemented by recruits who had bled alongside them. The Administratum catalogued this moment as Unofficial Reinforcement Event Alpha, the beginning of what would later become a long tradition of the Ghosts absorbing survivors and proven fighters from warzones where they had served. These non-Tanith soldiers were formally designated as members of the First and Only, but were required to accept regimental customs and command hierarchy without exception. Gaunt personally oversaw their integration, insisting on their full inclusion in both operations and memorial rites. Across subsequent campaigns, and including the missions on Monthhax, Hagia and Herodor, the Tanith's reputation became a point of quiet contention among High Command. While results remained exemplary, multiple command staff filed internal complaints about the Ghosts' refusal to follow established Imperial Guard formation doctrine. Battle logs filed by General Nosches Sturm, later court-martialed for insubordination and failure to report heretical corruption, described the Tanith as loose elements that operate on instinct and delusion. Ironically, it was Tanith squads that exposed Sturm's attempted betrayal during the Hagia campaign by uncovering forbidden artifacts in his personal chambers. The field report, logged under Inquisitorial Oversight Seal 172D, credits Gaunt's discretion in alerting local Arbites before escalation. These incidents did not diminish the Ghost's operational status. Instead, they reinforced a growing perception within Administratum circles that while the Tanith may not align with conventional Guard doctrine, their results justified autonomy. By the early years of the 9th century of the 41st millennium, the Ghosts had been deployed in over 40 official campaigns, appeared in 5 high-profile Crusade dispatches, and were granted long-term operational designation by the Departamento Munitorum. This classification placed them in the same logistical category as permanent regiments, such as the Mordian Iron Guard and the Cadian Shock Troops. Still, the First and Only structure remained irregular. Their casualty recovery rate was low, but morale held. Each campaign added to the regiment's evolving identity, not just as survivors of a lost world, but as a doctrine in themselves. Administratum records increasingly reference them not as auxiliaries, but as primary operational assets for recon, disruption, and enemy sabotage. Strategic briefings began to include notations such as, if ghost insertion is possible, consider adjusting primary objective priorities. As the Sabbat Worlds Crusade intensified, the Administratum's own language around the Tanith began to shift. Early documents described them as forest recon, light mobile, or unorthodox scouts. By the end of the Herodor campaign, official memoranda simply referred to them as the Ghosts. In the bureaucratic corridors of the Imperium, as where language is often as slow as war itself, such a shift was rare. It reflected something the Administratum could not quantify with numbers or field graphs. The fact that the Tanith First and Only had become indispensable through pure execution, rather than expected performance. After the Vervenheave campaign and the subsequent integration of Verghastite personnel, the Tanith First and Only began a period of rapid redeployment across multiple active war zones. Their ability to operate with minimal support infrastructure made them a preferred choice for interim reinforcements, particularly in contested areas where traditional guard regiments could not be deployed in time. Administrator movement logs list over 17 unique theatre deployments between the years 800 and 812 of the 41st millennium, though some overlap due to parallel operations in neighbouring systems. The Month-Axe campaign, logged under Sabbat Crusade Directive 44A Month-Axe, was one of the first tests of the regiment's capacity to operate in Xenos-contaminated terrain. The world, located along the periphery of the Khan group, had been recently liberated from Chaos-aligned forces, but Imperial scouting reports indicated scattered Eldar warband sightings across the southern hemisphere. The Ghosts were deployed as a forward reconnaissance to confirm or deny these claims. Within 5 standard days of planetfall, Tanith patrols under Sergeant McCall reported visual contact with unidentified humanoid figures in shimmering armour, moving through the fog-bound forests, a topographical echo of Tanith itself. Administratum field transcripts show that the regiment engaged in a series of low-intensity skirmishes, exchanging fire with Eldar elements believed to be from the Alatok craft world. The Ghosts suffered minimal losses, but their reports contain detailed descriptions of Eldar stealth methods, including optical camouflage, monomolecular blades, and silent mobility systems. Gaunt filed a detailed encounter report with accompanying maps of known Eldar movement routes. These maps were later absorbed into the Ordo Xenos restricted archive, but the Administratum retained a redacted version in the Month-Axe campaign dossier. The campaign's outcome was a limited Imperial hold of the Northern Hemisphere, with Xenos resistance deemed ongoing but non-critical. The Tanith were withdrawn after 36 standard days, with their after-action summary labelled Complete Success under conditions of restricted visibility and non-human threat. It marked the first documented instance of the regiment engaging non-chaos opponents under official orders, and the Administratum classified their performance as admirable under uncertain threat taxonomy. Shortly afterward, the Tanith were redirected to Hagia, a shrine world experiencing internal unrest. Initial intelligence classified the uprising as a local revolt against Munitorum requisitioning policies. Upon arrival, however, Ghost reconnaissance teams uncovered that the rebellion had been seeded by chaos cults infiltrating the ranks of the local Adepta Sororitas and Ecclesiarchy suborders. Their findings were forwarded to the Crusade's command echelon, and within 2 weeks, Hagia was reclassified as a high-threat world under covert chaos control. The Ghost's operations in Hagia included targeted eliminations of cult leaders, guided artillery strikes based on recon-obtained coordinates, and recovery of sacred relics from compromised ecclesiastical vaults. Most notably, a platoon under Sergeant Caffron was documented as having intercepted and neutralised a Chaos Psyker cell attempting to open a warp breach inside the Archenhold Basilica. The event was marked in Administratum Psyker incident logs, with Gaunt's follow-up report noting the unrecoverable mental degradation of 2 soldiers exposed to psychic backwash. They were given full honours and listed as lost in service. After Hagia, the regiment participated in the Herodor campaign, a turning point in the Crusade. Herodor had strategic and religious significance, housing multiple St. Sabbat shrines and relics. As such, the planet's defence became a political priority as much as a military one. The Ghosts were assigned to operations around Civitas Beati, a city overrun by chaos forces and fortified with warp-enhanced architecture. Gaunt's own tactical journals, later archived by the Administratum under Command Addendum 292HR, describe the terrain as barely real, a place where the rules of engagement do not hold unless enforced by sheer will. In one of the most critical documented engagements of the campaign, Tanith units were inserted via grav chute into the upper spires of the Civitas to destroy a warp broadcast relay drawing energy from the buried heart of the Shrine City. The operation was designated Silent Hymn and was personally overseen by Gaunt and Major Rawn. Despite heavy losses during descent due to anti-air flak bursts, the objective was completed within 3 hours of drop. The spire collapsed, destabilizing the warp energy matrix. Administratum records marked the event as Crusade critical success, noting the Ghost's disproportionate impact relative to manpower invested. It was during Herodor that the legend of St. Sabbat's reincarnation, or physical manifestation, was first tied to the Ghosts. Administratum reports on the matter were heavily redacted by inquisitorial oversight, but open documents confirm that Gaunt and elements of the First and Only were present during the so-called miracle at Saints Hollow. While Gaunt never filed a personal account, the Departamento Munitorum awarded campaign honours to the Ghosts under the title Guardians of the Saint. This honorific was unique in Crusade history and reflected the high political value placed on the regiment after Herodor. Following this, their operational tempo accelerated. The Tanith First and Only participated in the assault on Fantine, a gas giant with habitable high-altitude platforms. The campaign was unconventional. All combat took place in floating cities and atmospheric strata. The Ghosts trained rapidly for zero-G and low-grav operations. Administratum documentation lists over a dozen successful sabotage missions against airlift depots and atmospheric filtration plants. One report details the Ghosts disabling an entire Chaos air wing by destroying their fuel supply mid-transit, using timed charges embedded in refueling lines. Fantine's campaign report, compiled by the Crusade's logistics arm, directly credited the Ghosts with allowing ground-based forces to advance unimpeded due to air superiority attrition caused by non-conventional guard elements. The phrase non-conventional guard elements became an unofficial nickname for the Tanith across multiple Crusade sectors, often used as a quiet compliment among staff officers trying to requisition their services. One of the more sensitive deployments occurred on Geryon, a world under Chaos occupation for over a decade. The Tanith were assigned to a covert liberation task force alongside selected elements of the Crusade's intelligence cadre. Administratum records from Geryon are fragmented, many filed under sealed Inquisition clearance. However, surviving field reports indicate that the Ghosts remained embedded behind enemy lines for an extended duration, reportedly over a year. They conducted sabotage operations, assassinations of cult leaders, and the destruction of tainted supply lines without formal support or resupply. The Geryon campaign took a psychological toll on the regiment. When Gaunt and his soldiers were extracted, medical assessments filed with the Munitorum listed several operatives as combat effective but spiritually destabilized. This language, rare in standard administratum documentation, suggested possible warp exposure or moral compromise. Regardless, the Ghosts were cleared for return to duty after only brief recovery time, and were noted as having retained full chain of command integrity despite deep campaign penetration. Each campaign layered new context over the Ghosts' reputation. Their casualty rates remained high, but never unmanageable. Reinforcement requests continued, particularly from regiments or commanders who had served with them previously. Administratum projection models for Crusade logistics often included Tanith option, contingency plans, insertion of a Ghost platoon to destabilize entrenched positions before the arrival of heavy guard forces. Their value as a force multiplier became factored into Crusade-level doctrine. By the year 815 of the 41st millennium, the Tanith First and Only were no longer viewed as a makeshift regiment salvaged from a destroyed world. They were embedded within Crusade operations at the strategic level. Administratum dispatches to Lord Militant Command referenced them in the same tone as elite regiments, not for their numbers, but for their precision. Despite their informal customs, decentralized structure, and non-standard communication methods, the Ghosts had earned formal trust within the highest echelons of Imperial command. Their presence on a war zone was no longer treated as an experiment in light infantry tactics. It was treated as an investment, one that paid off, campaign after campaign, in enemy collapse and strategic disruption. The Tanith had moved beyond myth. They were now part of the Imperium's strategic doctrine, a regiment shaped by loss, sustained by memory, and operationalized by data. By the middle decades of the Sabbat Worlds Crusade, the Tanith First and Only had developed a fully mature operational identity. This was no longer the provisional regiment salvaged from a dead world. It was now a core strategic asset utilised by Crusade Command across dozens of sectors. Administratum campaign charts, particularly those compiled under the Strategic Forecasting Unit at Spashard Mons, began marking zones of high complexity or environmental obscuration with standardised notes requesting ghost-compatible deployment, a coded indication that the Tanith skill set was necessary to bypass terrain limitations or reduce logistic burden. Among the most significant of their late-stage deployments was the campaign on Ancrion Sextus. Classified as a mid-level fortress world, Ancrion had been converted into a forward operating base for chaos-aligned planetary militias and traitor regiments. Administratum projections expected a prolonged siege, with early engagement forecasts estimating a campaign length of 120 standard days. However, the Tanith were inserted prior to the main assault, deploying covertly through storm tunnels beneath the main hive structures. Their objective was to disable internal Vox networks and eliminate enemy command elements before the Imperial bombardment began. Official battle records from the Departamento Tactici logged the results. Communication failure across enemy positions within 2 hours of the Ghost's insertion, followed by the sudden collapse of enemy troop coordination. When the main assault force arrived, they encountered disorganized resistance. The siege was resolved in 39 days, a quarter of the projected duration. The campaign commendation for Ancrion Sextus, signed by Lord Militon Cybon himself, noted the Ghost's performance as a masterstroke of timing, deception and substructure exploitation. Casualty records for the operation showed 27 confirmed fatalities among the Ghosts, a figure that drew concern from Munitorum logistics officers due to the shrinking manpower pool. Reinforcement pipelines had always been thin. The First and Only did not receive replacement drafts in the traditional sense. Instead, they continued the practice first, formalised after Vervunhive, incorporating volunteers and survivors from worlds they liberated, provided they passed internal trials and accepted Tanith regimental structure. By this period, the regiment's composition had become approximately 55% pureblood Tanith, 30% Verghastite, and 15% Belladon and other assimilated elements. While this cultural blend risked fragmentation, Gaunt's central command, reinforced by sergeants like McColl, Rawn and Val, ensured cohesion through shared campaign memory, not birthright. Administratum archivists noted that this unconventional structure actually reduced discipline incidents compared to traditional regiments. The Ghosts lacked the class divides or planetary rivalries that plagued other mixed units. Their code was survival. Their hierarchy was shaped by deed, not lineage. Gaunt's policy of decentralized initiative meant that squads operated with relative autonomy, which in turn encouraged merit-based leadership. This structure required higher tactical trust, a trait the Administratum generally distrusted, but repeated battlefield data confirmed that the Ghosts consistently executed objectives faster than expected, with fewer logistical demands. During the campaign on Asphodel, an urban death world laced with booby traps and biological hazards, the Tanith were tasked with rooting out cultist insurgents using the sewers of Hive Diest. It was a mission with no clear entry points and no reliable enemy mapping. The Departamento Munitorum recommended saturation bombardment. Gaunt countered with a Ghost insertion plan, phased entry through heat vents, establishing a killbox perimeter using silent comms and zero-light visibility gear. The mission succeeded, though at cost. 53 Ghosts were killed, and 2 platoons were nearly wiped out during a secondary detonation event triggered by enemy proximity sensors. However, all enemy resistance in the sector was neutralised within 48 hours, and the Hive's water purification system was restored without structural collapse. Administratum analysis flagged the Ghost's operation as a statistical outlier, unusually effective for a non-mechanized regiment operating without armor or air support. Their status was updated in the Crusade's Living Tactical Index to High Utility Special Conditions Response Unit, a rare classification reserved for units that performed beyond doctrine expectation in unpredictable environments. Internal wear and tear on the regiment became more evident during these later years. The Ghost gear, maintained obsessively by its users, was showing signs of unreplaceable degradation. Their signature camo cloaks, many passed down from the Tanith founding day itself, were patched with scavenged materials from multiple worlds. Their lasguns were hybrids of Munitorum standard pattern and personal field modifications. Optical gear was often shared between squads, and several soldiers reportedly operated with cracked lenses or degraded Auspex readings. Requests for resupply were approved irregularly, as Crusade logistics favoured regiments with larger tactical footprints. Nonetheless, Gaunt refused to allow his regiment's condition to be used as an excuse. They continued to deploy, continued to win, and continued to survive on the edge of Imperial infrastructure. One major campaign that tested this endurance was the operation on Belladon, a high-profile Crusade world with heavy symbolic and logistical importance. Belladon was among the most densely defended Chaos strongholds in the region, and Crusade Command invested enormous manpower and material into its reclamation. The Ghosts were assigned to assist in the breach of Fortress Dexia, a substructure built into the mountain range surrounding the central hive. Their role was not direct assault, but infiltration, insertion through avalanche tunnels created by macro shell barrages, followed by internal mapping and sabotage. Belladon's operational logs, recorded in a classified annex to the Crusade Master Index, list the Ghosts as executing simultaneous detonations across 3 pressure conduits feeding the fortress's automated defense system. This action allowed a full breach by the primary assault regiments within 12 hours. While other units received glory for the frontal assault, Administratum Commendation forms credited the Ghosts with complete mission success against maximal environmental constraints. The report also noted that Tanith casualties included 3 veteran squad leaders, whose loss permanently altered regimental tactical formation, though no discipline breakdown occurred. The final years of documented activity in this era saw the Ghosts stretched thin. Their numbers fluctuated between 900 and 1,200 active duty soldiers, depending on rotation, injury, and absorption. The Munitorum repeatedly flagged them as a regiment in decline, citing concerns over longevity, recruitment limitations, and lack of heavy support. However, Operational Command consistently pushed back, citing their success rates, adaptability, and morale. The Ghosts were one of the few regiments to show no major desertion incidents, no catastrophic breakdowns in command, and no refusal of orders, even when placed into near-suicidal missions. At no point during this period did the Ghosts abandon an objective. In situations where other regiments had failed, including on worlds like Lyubov, Urdesh, and Belladon, the Tanith succeeded by leveraging stealth, precision, and patient attrition. Administratum evaluations began to shift focus. Rather than questioning the regiment's sustainability, they began studying it. A small subunit within the Crusade's record-keeping bureau initiated a long-term pattern analysis of Tanith operations. Their hypothesis: the Ghost's success stemmed not only from training or tactics, but from cultural assimilation of trauma into military utility. This conclusion was never formally published, but the data remained, tucked into footnotes and side charts, building a quiet consensus. The Tanith First and Only were not optimal by traditional measures. They lacked formal armour, they operated with inconsistent gear. Their numbers dwindled, but their cohesion, initiative, and results placed them in a unique category. The Administratum eventually stopped referring to them as provisional or ad hoc. They became a permanent line item, a regiment like no other, sustained not by bureaucracy but by will. By the end of their second Crusade decade, the Tanith First and Only had appeared in over 70 operational logs, been credited with critical objectives in 35 distinct campaigns, and received 4 Crusade-level commendations. They had fought across jungle, hive, mountain, oceanic, subterranean, and even orbital terrain. They had won victories no one else was expected to win, and they had done it all with silence, shadows, and a name whispered more often in fear than in fame. The Ghosts no longer needed a planet. Their story had been written not in soil, but in record. a regiment that should not have survived became one the Imperium could not afford to lose. The Inquisition's earliest classified references to the Tanith First and Only appear not in connection with chaos, taint or heretical deviation, but in observational reports filed during the campaign on Fortis Binary. An attached Ordo Hereticus monitoring cell embedded with Lord General Draver's headquarters flagged the Ghost's non-standard field methods and untraceable movement patterns as points of interest. These comments were not filed as accusations but as early behavioural notes. The report cited an engagement where a Tanith recon team bypassed 3 layers of perimeter security without triggering motion sensors or proximity alarms, and then withdrew without contact. The phrase "possible warp-based concealment, unconfirmed" was added, though it was later struck through and replaced with native stealth specialization. More critical scrutiny began during the Hargia campaign. Ordo Hereticus operatives were already active on world due to concerns over corrupted ecclesiastical relics and suspected heretic presence in the lower shrines. During the operation known as Civitas Reclamation Phase 2, multiple Tanith squads engaged cultist forces inside sacred catacombs beneath the Arch of Sabbath. According to inquisitorial field sensors, psychic disturbance signatures spiked during the final minutes of the incursion. Gaunt's squads exited the structure with minimal casualties, and the relics they recovered were cleared by local ministorum authorities. However, the Inquisition's internal review raised concern. Audio logs from the catacombs revealed whispered phrases not spoken by any recorded voice. Several echoes did not match the environmental acoustics. Vox interference levels during the operation were consistent with minor warp bleed, suggesting the relic chamber had not been properly sanctified. No taint was found on the Tanith involved, and their post-mission purity checks returned clean. Still, a red-level subfile was created within the Ordo Hereticus archives titled Tanith Contamination Watch, pending pattern emergence. Despite this, no formal censure was ever issued. The Ghosts had achieved tactical victory, and Gaunt's report, though sparse in detail, included a brief warning that the relics should not be reassigned without further study. This was interpreted by one Inquisitor as a cautious signal disguised as operational summary. The Ghosts, it seemed, had the sense to know when to keep quiet. One of the most significant inquisitorial investigations involving the Tanith occurred following the Geryon campaign. That world had been occupied by chaos for more than a decade, and the deployment of Imperial forces behind enemy lines, with no external support and extreme proximity to warp-active cults, created major risk of spiritual degradation. Gaunt and a small cadre of Ghosts operated on Geryon for over a full standard year, engaging in high-risk sabotage missions, targeted assassinations and prolonged psychological exposure to the corruption of an entire planet. When extraction was finally achieved, Ordo Hereticus oversight teams intercepted the returning personnel before reintegration. Standard protocol mandated full debrief, mental purification, and possible memory suppression. Gaunt protested, citing the loyalty, performance, and retained integrity of his regiment. He filed a formal declaration of purity, backed by third-party attestations from Crusade Command and several high-ranking ecclesiarchal observers. The Inquisition, wary of undermining morale, allowed the majority of returning Ghosts to rejoin active service, but initiated a shadow observation cycle across their future deployments. According to suppressed internal logs, one of the returning Ghosts, identity redacted, exhibited signs of increased emotional disassociation, chronic insomnia, and heightened perceptual awareness. When questioned by inquisitorial minders, the subject reportedly stated, "I see too clearly now, there's no veil left." The interview file was flagged for immediate containment, but later closed without follow-up. Gaunt insisted that no Ghost was spiritually compromised. He acknowledged trauma, not corruption. The Inquisition did not agree, but lacked sufficient cause to act. During the Herodor campaign, further attention was drawn to the regiment. This time, the Ordo Synos opened a parallel inquiry due to the event known as the Saints' Return. While the public interpretation of the event leaned toward miraculous revelation, multiple inquisitorial assets raised concerns over the legitimacy of the phenomenon. Several claimed that the Saint Sabbat apparition exhibited inconsistent psychic signatures. Others questioned the validity of Gaunt's personal interactions with her, noting that no psyker on the ground, not even sanctioned ones, suffered feedback from her presence. The Tanith were not accused of deception. However, their proximity to the event, their central role in the defense of the location, and the lack of any warp contamination among their number were viewed with quiet suspicion. Order Malleus operatives filed an unconfirmed theory that the ghost's psychic null profile, the complete absence of taint, mutation, or excessive faith-induced resonance, may indicate an unusual resistance to warp-based manipulation. A minority opinion within the Inquisition even suggested that the Tanith regimental structure itself had begun to form a kind of psychic inertial field, cohesion so strong, belief so focused, that outside influences could not gain purchase. This theory was neither accepted nor formally rejected. It was recorded, coded for suppression, and buried beneath higher priority case files. But in multiple subsequent incidents where the ghosts operated near warp phenomena, including engagements on Verghast hives collapsed under city and in the psychic storm zones of Phanton's upper atmosphere, their survival and performance were consistently noted as disproportionately stable. A classified memo recovered from the Sector Inquisitorial Conclave, dated year 819 of the 41st millennium, summarized the concern. Tanith First and Only exhibit persistent operational success under environments marked by extreme psychic corruption, prolonged proximity to warp artifacts, and unsanctioned phenomena. No incidences of heretical speech, demonic invocation, or mutation have been recorded. Continued observation warranted. Possibility: unique cultural immunity to chaos infiltration, cause unknown. The ghosts themselves remained unaware of most of these inquiries. No official declarations were made, no field suppression teams were activated, and no interrogator-level interventions were deployed. Gaunt maintained full command, his record intact. However, the presence of inquisitorial observers, sometimes posing as munitorum auditors, medical staff, or vox operators, continued throughout the latter stages of their known campaigns. Their reports became less frequent over time, not because interest waned, but because patterns solidified. The Tanith did not change, they did not fracture, they did not break under pressure or proximity. They simply continued, quiet, focused, and dangerously consistent. To the Inquisition, this was both a reassurance and a warning. Units that never change are either incorruptible, or already claimed by something beyond reach. One of the most contentious events involving the Tanith First and Only occurred during the later stages of the Gerian occupation. Following their extended insertion, the ghosts were not immediately exfiltrated through formal Crusade channels. Instead, their return was managed through covert channels arranged by Ibram Gaunt himself, assisted by a rogue inquisitor of the Order Hereticus, identity suppressed, status later declared excommunicate. This decision directly violated established munitorum repatriation protocols and led to an immediate internal inquest by Crusade Command. According to Inquisition Black-level audit logs, the extraction itself was executed aboard a stealth-equipped transport vessel, with no transponder codes filed to any known sector fleet. The ghosts who returned from Gerion were not debriefed in sequence. Instead, they were held in isolation for over 4 standard weeks, while various Ordo agents cycled through observational and psychic evaluation protocols. Of the operatives involved, 6 were reportedly marked with temporary mind scarring symptoms consistent with low-grade warp residue. However, no such symptoms were recorded among the ghosts themselves. This contradiction raised further alarm. Inquisitorial inquiry documents indicate that several interrogators believed the ghosts had either been shielded by an unknown field effect, or had been altered in a way that rendered them undetectable to standard psi scanning. Gaunt refused further questioning. he filed a sealed protest citing operational necessity and invoked Crusade-wide exceptional mandate powers that had been granted to him by War Master Slado before the latter's death. Although the protest was reluctantly honoured, the incident placed the entire Garian mission under restricted review for the remainder of the Crusade. That operation was not the only one to draw shadow attention. During the Herodor campaign, a detachment of Ordo Xenos agents inserted into the theatre 2 days before the ghosts made contact with the apparition, identified by Imperial consensus as Saint Sabbat returned. The agents, embedded under the guise of Munitorum logistics officers, reportedly attempted to make direct contact with the figure, only to be repelled by what later reports describe as violent field displacement, a non-lethal psychic pulse that threw the observers back without causing injury. Vox logs from the ghosts nearby recorded no unusual phenomenon. When cross-referenced with inquisitorial surveillance, the data appeared selectively blank. Certain moments had failed to imprint on any surrounding recording device. Gaunt's account of the encounter was subdued. He confirmed the event, described its spiritual significance, and declined further elaboration. The Inquisition's response was mixed. Some classified the manifestation as authentic divine intervention. Others suspected a psychomasquerade. The Tanith's unshaken composure during the incident, neither terrified nor overzealous, was interpreted by certain Ordo personnel as evidence of foreknowledge. An observation by Interrogator Paladar of the Ordo Hereticus, filed under Seal 6 level and later marked for suppression, summarized the concern. The ghosts did not behave as witnesses of a miracle. They behaved as if the miracle had already spoken to them. In a separate incident logged during the campaign on Verghast Hive, several Tanith squads operated in proximity to an ancient archaeotech vault uncovered during seismic activity beneath the Hive's central spire. Although the vault was deemed dormant, Magos biologists from the Adeptus Mechanicus filed cautionary notes suggesting exposure risks from pre-imperial technology. 2 squads of the Tanith were assigned to secure the perimeter, while tech priests examined the structure. When contact with the Mechanicus personnel was lost, Gaunt dispatched Sergeant McCall's team to investigate. The squad returned without incident, reporting that the vault had partially collapsed. No trace of the tech priests remained. Inquisitorial forensic teams later found no signs of battle, contamination, or foul play. However, a small data core recovered from the vault had been damaged in what appeared to be a controlled overload. The core, once partially decrypted, revealed partial machine language logs referring to non-human algorithms and predictive control structures. While no evidence linked the ghosts to the overload, the proximity of the incident to their deployment was sufficient to generate further suspicion. The Inquisition did not act on this case. The data core was claimed by the Ordo Xenos and shipped to an undisclosed facility. But the report included a margin note. Tanith units show recurring proximity to anomalous sites. Patterns suggest deliberate assignment or unseen affinity. Another unacknowledged confrontation occurred on the planet of Nace, a sub-hive mining world where the ghosts were briefly deployed during a routine suppression campaign. Their mission was to eliminate a chaos insurgency, reportedly centered around a corrupted PDF command structure. During the operation, a 2nd Imperial Guard regiment, the Volpone Bluebloods, entered the theatre under separate orders. Tensions escalated when a Volpone forward unit opened fire on a Tanith scout squad in a disputed zone. Gaunt demanded reparation. Volpone Command claimed the incident was a misfire, but within 24 hours 2 senior Volpone officers were found dead in their barracks, throats slit, no signs of forced entry. The Inquisition investigated. No formal charges were brought against the ghosts. However, an internal field agent stationed with the Ordo Hereticus filed an unsent report noting disproportionate retribution likely executed with precision and no evidence. The Tanith command hierarchy denied involvement. The case was left unresolved, and no further conflicts occurred between the regiments for the remainder of the campaign. Patterns such as these continued. The ghost kill ratios remained above standard. Their psychic taint reports remained at 0. Yet the events surrounding them often defied normal explanation. especially the silence that followed. One final case deserves note. On the ice world of Spartiate Tertius, the Tanith were deployed to eliminate a Chaos-aligned warband holding a remote comms facility. The engagement was classified as low threat. However, recovered vid-feed fragments from the engagement, confiscated by the Ordo Malleus, showed brief distortions in the audio track, followed by sudden mass silence across enemy channels. The battle ended with the Ghosts suffering no casualties and the entire enemy warband annihilated. Autopsies of the heretics showed no signs of conventional trauma, only cerebral hemorrhaging consistent with exposure to extreme psychic pressure. No sanctioned psychers were deployed with the Ghosts at the time. The Ordo Malleus sealed the report. No further investigation was permitted. The Ghosts were redeployed 3 days later without pause, but the file was appended with a single remark: "Whatever shields them may also be what strikes for them." As the Sabbat Worlds Crusade entered its final operational decades, the Inquisition's attention toward the Tanith First and Only transitioned from scrutiny to something far more complex. Quiet acknowledgement of utility paired with unspoken unease. The regiment's consistent proximity to high-risk anomalies, combined with their inexplicable resistance to corruption, created a strategic contradiction. In theory, they should have warranted full inquisitorial interdiction. In practice, their results protected them. A final compiled dossier from the Ordo Hereticus, marked "No Further Action," was issued in the year 823 of the 41st millennium. It summarized 2 decades of intersecting surveillance, evaluations, psi-scans, and classified debriefs. The report began with a sterile acknowledgement of the Ghost's service record: 73 active campaigns, 32 full victories, 11 classified engagements with unquantifiable outcomes. It then transitioned into behavioral analysis, stress endurance, trauma absorption, reaction under isolation, cognitive dissociation under warp exposure. In every category, the Ghosts displayed metrics inconsistent with baseline human performance, but not in a way that violated Imperial doctrine, rather in a way that quietly exceeded it. Embedded interrogator logs noted that most Tanith soldiers, when interviewed under Truthright or mild telepathic scan, expressed identical thematic responses to questions of survival, loyalty, or fear. "We've already lost everything. What's left can't be taken." The Inquisition did not interpret this as nihilism, but as structural inoculation against despair. It became a theory across 3 separate Ordo branches that the destruction of their homeworld, a trauma that would destabilize most regiments, had instead forged in them a psychological immunity to the warp's most common infection vectors: temptation, grief, memory distortion, and hope perversion. Not all Inquisitors accepted this. A smaller faction, particularly among Ordo Malleus observers, suspected that the Ghost's resilience was unnatural. One theory, logged but never acted upon, proposed that some unknown warp entity may have imprinted upon the regiment at the moment of Tanith's destruction, not as corruption, but as a permanent influence. The destruction of the world, the panic of evacuation, the rallying of survivors under Gaunt's command, it was an alignment of desperation, will and fear so intense that it may have created a psychic echo, a kind of persistent field woven through the survivors. This theory found some traction among psi theorists, especially those studying group field phenomena in long-deployed regiments. In standard cases, units exposed to prolonged war would suffer collective degradation, apathy, fear, or ideological drift. The Ghosts exhibited none of these patterns. Instead, they demonstrated strengthening cohesion. Their dead were memorialized internally. Squad rituals, unsanctioned but consistent, were performed in silence. No chaplains presided, no ecclesiarchal oversight was present, but no violations of faith were recorded. This internal spiritual discipline, paired with Gaunt's rigid secular command style, formed a unique hybrid profile. The Tanith believed in the Emperor, but not in the ceremony. They followed orders, but not blindly. And when confronted with the uncanny, They reacted not with awe, but with clarity. These behavioural traits were catalogued in a quiet subfile by the Ordo Xenos. Contingency asset status. Watch without interference. One final event sealed the file. During a late-stage deployment to the lost world of Nurth, the Ghosts were assigned to escort a delegation of Adeptus Mechanicus Magi attempting to salvage ancient data vaults beneath the planet's irradiated surface. Unknown to Imperial forces at the time, Nurth housed remnants of pre-Imperial Xenos-engineered architecture, partially submerged beneath tectonic drift. When the vault was breached, Mechanicus personnel attempted to initiate a data scrub, but several collapsed into catatonia before completing it. The Ghosts were ordered to secure the site while awaiting further clearance. During this operation, an undocumented phenomenon occurred. Multiple Vox units across the theatre recorded a single synchronized phrase, a voice that did not match any human speaker. Its words were short, untranslatable, and laced with distortion. No one among the Ghosts reported hearing it directly, but every unit with an open Vox link, regardless of distance, captured the phrase simultaneously. The file was transferred to Ordo Malleus crypt vaults and remains untranslated to this day. No evidence linked the event to the Tanith, no contamination was found, no consequences were recorded, but the note appended to the end of the Inquisition's compiled dossier reads simply, "They were the only ones inside the vault who stood still." Beyond that point, the records become sparse. The Tanith continued to serve, they continued to fight. They appeared in fewer classified archives, not because interest waned, but because their pattern had stabilized. They were no longer under suspicion, nor were they under protection. They were simply left alone, a unit that did not require interference. To the Inquisition, this was both a relief and a risk. Relieved, because the Ghosts never showed signs of weakness. Risk, because their strength did not come from approved sources. They were not the Emperor's chosen. They were not indoctrinated saints. They were simply survivors, weaponized by loss, led by a man who never claimed more than duty, and bonded by memory stronger than steel. The Ghosts operated in the margins of doctrine, and so they survived in the margins of oversight. In the end, the Tanith First and Only remained what they had always been, a mystery accepted, not solved. A regiment that did not break the rules, only outlasted them. They came from a world that no longer exists,